morning of December 17, 1944, was 10 degrees below freezing in the Belgian village of Krinkeled. A staff sergeant named Walter Cobb was sitting in the gunner's seat of an M36 tank destroyer when the radio man passed him a range estimate that made no immediate sense. 1,000 yards. Maybe more. Fog was still pooling in the low ground between their position and the tree line where the German column had been spotted. The reticle markings in his telescopic sight ran out past 4,000 yards, a fact that still seemed, to most men in the tank destroyer battalions, more theoretical than useful. Nobody expected to take a Tiger from that distance. The whole point, as every crew had been drilled to understand since Camp Hood, Texas, was to get close, go fast, shoot from the flank, and vanish before the German gunner could traverse and return fire. But the ground that morning was wrong for any of that. The road was sheeted in ice. The field to the left was too soft to cross. And the Tiger, when it appeared out of fog, was coming straight down the road with its 88 aimed directly at Cobb's position. What happened next? The decision made in about 4 seconds, the shot that followed, and what it revealed about the nature of armored warfare in the winter of 1944 is a story that gets lost in the larger narrative of the Battle of the Bulge every time. Bastogne gets the headlines. The 101st Airborne gets the film adaptations. But across the Ardennes that December and into January, dozens of smaller and equally desperate engagements were being fought by men in lightly armored vehicles who had been handed a weapon powerful enough to kill a Tiger and then given almost no time to figure out how. The story of how American tank destroyer crews actually solved that problem on frozen roads, in fog, under artillery, with no armor worth mentioning between them and the enemy, is worth telling in full. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why killing a Tiger at any range, let alone 1,500 yards, was considered a near impossible proposition in late 1944, you have to understand what the Tiger I actually was. Not the legend of it, which was enormous and partly earned, but the specific mechanical and ballistic reality that American crews encountered when they first met it in France. The Tiger I, officially designated the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung E, entered production in August 1942 and reached the Western Front in significant numbers during the Normandy campaign of 1944. It weighed approximately 50 tons, more than double the weight of a standard M4 Sherman. Its frontal armor plate was 100 millimeters thick, steeply angled enough at certain points to cause even powerful shells to deflect. The gun it carried, the 88mm KVK-36, could destroy a Sherman at ranges that the Sherman's own 75mm gun could barely reach, let alone penetrate return fire. German tank commanders understood this asymmetry well. Their standing doctrine was to engage American armor from the front at long range, where the Tiger was essentially invulnerable, and let the geometry of their armor advantage do the work. The American tank arm had understood since at least 1943 that the standard Sherman, equipped with its short 75mm gun, was not going to solve the Tiger problem head-on. Rounds from that gun striking the Tiger's frontal plate at standard engagement distances did not penetrate. They struck and deflected, leaving gouges in the face-hardened steel that the German crew could feel as a shudder but rarely as a threat. There are documented cases from the Rohr Plain battles of November 1944 in which a single Sherman fired 14 rounds at a Tiger before achieving any meaningful effect, and was then destroyed by a second Tiger before the crew could follow up. The arithmetic was not in favor of the Sherman. The answer that the United States Army had spent the better part of 1943 and early 1944 developing was a vehicle that was not a tank. It was by doctrine something else entirely, a specialized weapon designed to meet the German armor threat through a combination of firepower, speed, and aggressive ambush tactics rather than through the head-on slugging match the Tiger was built to win. That vehicle was the M36 90mm gun motor carriage, and by the autumn of 1944, it had reached the front in Europe in numbers sufficient to matter. The M36 was, at its core, a brutally pragmatic piece of engineering. Its chassis was adapted from the M10 tank destroyer, which was itself derived from the M4A2 Sherman hull. This was deliberate. Standardizing the drivetrain and lower hull on proven components meant that mechanics already familiar with Sherman maintenance could keep M36S running in the field without extensive retraining. The critical modification was the turret. Where the M10 had carried a 3-inch gun in an open, lightly armored turret, the M36 mounted the 90mm M3 cannon, an adaptation of the same anti-aircraft gun that had already proven devastating against German armor on the Eastern Front when the Soviets adapted similar caliber weapons to their Su-85 and IS-series vehicles. The 90mm gun fired a standard armor-piercing capped round at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,600 feet per second, and at a range of 1,000 yards. That round would punch through 5.5 inches of rolled homogeneous armor. The Tiger Eye's side hull armor was approximately 80 millimeters thick, just over 3 inches. The Tiger Eye's side turret armor was 80 millimeters. At 1,000 yards, a clean side shot from a 90mm M3 gun penetrated both. The problem was getting the side shot. German Tiger crews knew exactly what the M36 could do to them from the side. They had read the same performance tables from captured American documents and from their own testing programs that evaluated Allied ammunition recovered from battlefields. The response was doctrinal. Tiger commanders fighting on the Western Front were instructed to keep their frontal armor toward the threat whenever possible, to engage at ranges that exceeded the effective fighting range of lighter American vehicles, and to use terrain, ridgelines, berms, stone walls, sunken roads to protect their flanks. This was not always possible. The Ardennes forest, with its narrow lanes and dense tree lines, often denied Tigers the long sight lines they needed to operate at their preferred engagement distances. Villages meant corners. Corners meant exposure. And exposure, even for a few seconds, meant an M36 crew with a loaded breech, and a clear angle had a window that might not come again. The 90mm gun did have one additional factor in its favor that the standard 75mm Sherman rounds did not, and that was a high-velocity armor-piercing tracer round designated the M304 HVPT, which packed a tungsten carbide core inside a lighter carrier. When fired from the M36, this round exceeded 2,900 feet per second at the muzzle and could penetrate figures that the standard armor-piercing round could not reach. Against the Tiger's frontal armor of 100 millimeters at combat ranges, the standard round would ricochet. The HVAPD round improved those odds dramatically. The problem, and it was a significant logistical problem throughout the winter campaign, was scarcity. The tungsten carbide cores required for HVAPT ammunition were a limited resource. Most of the rounds that reached M36 crews in the field were the standard armor-piercing cap variety. Crews hoarded their HVAPD rounds the way they hoarded morphine syrettes and dry socks. You saved them for moments that justified the expenditure. By December 16, 1944, when the German offensive began in the Ardennes, the American tank destroyer battalions attached to 1st Army were positioned across a front that had been considered quiet enough to use as a rest and training area for divisions recovering from the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. The 88 Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 723rd, among others, were operating in sectors that had seen minimal armored contact for weeks. Their crews had used a relative calm to work on their vehicles, conduct gunnery training on frozen Belgian fields, and rotate men through rest billets in farmhouses that still had intact roofs. Nobody was expecting a major German armored assault. The intelligence picture, as it had been presented down through corps and division, suggested that the German army on the Western Front was exhausted, short of fuel, and incapable of sustaining a large offensive operation. What actually came through the Ardennes tree line on the morning of December 16th was a force of roughly 200,000 German troops, supported by approximately 600 tanks and assault guns across a front stretching nearly 90 miles from Monshaw in the north to Echternach in the south. 3 German armies were committed to the operation. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, drove the northern route. The 5th Panzer Army under Osso von Manchefeld pushed through the center. The 7th Army covered the southern flank. The combined armored strength included Panthers, Panzer IVs, and a significant number of Tiger I and Tiger II vehicles concentrated primarily with the SS formations, particularly with the 1st SS Panzer Division commanded by the man who would become the most feared single name of the entire Battle of the Bulge, Joachim Paper. The American units caught by this assault in the first 48 hours suffered catastrophically. The 106th Infantry Division in the Schnee-Eifel lost 2 full regiments, surrounded, and forced to surrender. Approximately 8,000 men captured, one of the largest mass surrenders of American forces in the European theater. The 99th Infantry Division, positioned on Elsenborn Ridge, held, but at enormous cost. The 28th Infantry Division, in the center, was shredded across a 30-mile front. From the perspective of the tank destroyer battalion's position across the northern shoulder of this sector, the first news that reached them was not from official channels, but from the sound, the particular quality of artillery that arrives in volume. Sustained and rolling rather than sporadic and scattered, that experienced soldiers recognized as something larger than harassment fire. The men who would have to stop the German armor advance with their M36s in the days that followed were not, in the main, professional soldiers who had grown up with these machines. They were draftees and volunteers from every part of the United States who had been trained at Camp Hood and Camp Bowie in Texas under a doctrine that emphasized speed, aggression, and above all, the flanking shot. The tank destroyer force had been built around a specific and deeply contested tactical theory that massed German armor, when attacked, should be met not by defending tanks, but by a dedicated anti-armor force held in reserve and committed aggressively only when the German thrust had been identified and could be engaged from a position of advantage. The tank destroyers were not supposed to slug it out with Tiger tanks. They were supposed to ambush them. The problem with this doctrine, which had been argued over in staff schools and training centers since 1942, was that it assumed a degree of order and positional clarity in a defense that the Battle of the Bulge simply did not provide. When the German offensive broke through American lines across a 90-mile front in the first 48 hours, the tank destroyer battalions did not receive clear orders telling them where the German armored spearheads were concentrating. They received fragmentary information, often hours out of date, delivered by runners or by radio traffic that had to compete with the panic traffic of fragmenting infantry units trying to find their own headquarters. A crew that woke on the morning of December 17th expecting to maintain a vehicle checkpoint on a road that had been considered rear area secure might find, by mid-morning, that the infantry battalion they were attached to had withdrawn through the night, and the road behind them was no longer clear. It was in this environment of fractured information and collapsing defensive lines that American tank destroyer crews began engaging German armor, not from carefully prepared ambush positions, but from whatever position they happened to occupy when the German tanks appeared. The engagements that resulted were sometimes exactly what the doctrine had promised. Quick shots from the flank, the German tank brewing up before the crew could respond, the M36 moving before the return fire arrived. Sometimes they were nothing like that. They were close-range, head-on engagements in village streets where the distances involved were measured in tens of yards rather than hundreds, and where the question of which vehicle had the better gun or heavier armor was temporarily irrelevant compared to which crew was quicker, calmer, and luckier in that specific second. And sometimes, not often, but documented, there were long-range shots across open snowfields in conditions that nobody's training had fully prepared them for. The ground in the Ardennes in December 1944 was not uniformly frozen. The cold varied significantly by elevation and by time of day. On the high ridges it was solid, and track vehicles could move across field without bogging. In the lower ground and in the stream valleys, the top layer of earth would freeze overnight but could soften in the afternoon hours, turning the margins of fields into treacherous ground where a 50-ton Tiger would sink to its lower hull and a 28-ton M36 would not do much better. Snow complicated the visibility problem in both directions. An M36 in a firing position at the edge of a wood line was nearly invisible from 500 yards if the crew had taken care to break up the outline of the vehicle. A Tiger moving down a road in open country was harder to conceal, but the fog, the persistent low-lying fog of the Ardennes winter, could erase a tank completely at 300 yards and could close down faster than a crew could react. The specific qualities of winter shooting at long range were not well addressed in American gunnery doctrine of 1944. The main gunnery manual in use, Field Manual 1712, provided penetration tables and range estimation guidance that assumed clear visibility and standard atmospheric conditions. In practice, The 90mm M3 gun used on the M36 had a maximum telescopic sight range of 4,600 yards, a distance that appeared in the field manual, but that very few crews had actually fired at in training. At Camp Hood, standard gunnery qualification ranges were 500 to 1,000 yards. The mechanics of long-range shooting with the 90mm gun involved drift correction for the slight rotation of the shell in flight, elevation adjustments for the arc of a round that was traveling far enough to begin falling measurably before it arrived, and the estimation of target speed and movement that became increasingly difficult as range extended. All of this was achievable. It required practice and a steady hand, and a gunner who had thought through the problem before the moment arrived. By December of 1944, the crews who had been in combat since the Normandy breakout in July had accumulated roughly 5 months of that practice. The crews who had arrived as replacements in October or November had not. The first documented kill of a German heavy tank by an M36 from a range exceeding 1,000 yards in the European theater came before the Ardennes offensive, during the Ruhr Plain fighting in November 1944, when M36S of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 2nd Armored Division, were operating near the German town of Geilenkirchen. The 702nd was one of the first TD battalions to receive M36S in the field, transitioning from its earlier M10 equipment in late October. The November battles gave its crews their first sustained combat experience with a 90mm gun against German armor, including Panthers and Tigers operating in the relatively open ground east of the Ruhr River. The battalion's after-action reports from this period record specific engagements at ranges the crews had not previously attempted, and they record something that the field manual had not fully communicated, that at those ranges, against a vehicle as massive as a Tiger, the geometry of the shot mattered as much as the power of the gun. At a range of 1,500 yards, a 90mm armor-piercing, capped round striking the Tiger Eye's side hull at a perpendicular angle would penetrate. The armor figures are unambiguous. The Tiger Eye's side hull was 80mm of roll plate. The 90mm gun's penetration at 1,500 yards against rolled homogeneous armor was approximately 5 inches, roughly 127mm. The physics worked. What the physics could not account for was whether the shot would arrive perpendicular. At 1,500 yards, a small angular error in the gunner's aim, a Tiger that had turned a few degrees toward the shooter, presenting a slightly oblique face rather than a pure broadside, could deflect a round that the tables predicted would penetrate. The Tiger's crew knew this. The tactical response was instinctive for experienced Panzer crews. When you cannot close the hatches fast enough to avoid a hit, you turn into the threat and hope your frontal armor holds while you identify the source of fire and eliminate it. What this meant in practical terms was that the 1,500-yard shot at a Tiger was not simply a question of pointing the gun at the side of the tank and pulling the trigger. It was a question of catching a Tiger at an angle and at a moment when the crew had not yet registered the presence of the M36 and had not yet begun to rotate. The crew that made such a shot had to have identified the target before the target identified them, had to have estimated the range and the angle with precision under whatever conditions the battlefield offered, and had to have fired while all those factors were simultaneously favorable, which in the fog and cold and chaos of the Ardennes winter was an intersection of circumstances that arrived unpredictably and departed fast. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Near the German town of Freihaldenhoven, in December 1944, a crew from the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion used an M36 to kill a King Tiger, the more heavily armored and heavier Tiger II variant, with a side shot to the turret from approximately 1,000 yards. The King Tiger's turret side armor was 80mm. The 90mm gun at 1,000 yards had the penetration to defeat it. What the crew had managed in that specific engagement was to position themselves where the angle worked and fire before the King Tiger could respond. It is documented in the unit's after-action reports. It is a kill that required the M36 to be where doctrine said it should be, attacking from a position of advantage, exploiting a fleeting window of exposure, and it is a kill that illustrates exactly what made long-range Tiger engagements possible when they occurred and impossibly difficult most of the time. The story of how American crews learned to create those windows in a winter campaign that was colder and more disorganized and more brutal than anything their training had anticipated. It is also the story of a doctrine being tested to destruction and rebuilt from what survived. The crews who learned to create those windows in December 1944 did it through a process that had nothing romantic about it. It was a process of observation, repetition, and the slow accumulation of specific knowledge about how German armor behaved under pressure. Knowledge that no field manual fully encoded, because it was knowledge born entirely from combat. A Tiger crew that believed itself concealed from a particular angle would not rotate its turret until it saw a muzzle flash or heard a round strike. The moment between the flash and the traverse was the window. It opened in roughly 2 to 4 seconds, depending on how quickly the German gunner responded and how alert the crew had been before the shot was fired. 2 to 4 seconds, at 1,000 yards, was time enough for a second round from an M36. It was not always enough at 1,500. What made 1,500-yard shots against Tigers rare but real, not fabricated, but genuinely documented as a category of event, was a combination of terrain, target behavior, and ammunition management that a small number of experienced M36 crews had assembled into something approaching a working method. The method involved, at its core, the recognition that the Tiger was more dangerous when it was moving than when it was stationary, and more dangerous facing you than when it was traversed away. A Tiger moving down a road in open country had its gun pointed roughly in the direction of movement. A crew in a firing position at the flank of that road, in a wood line behind a berm, positioned where the Tiger would pass rather than where it was approaching, had the angular advantage that the ballistic math required. The shot was side armor, not front armor. The range could be managed if the crew had ranged the road while the Tiger was still out of view and had set the elevation on the sight before the target appeared. The timing was dictated by the speed of the German vehicle and the geometry of the firing position. When all of these factors aligned, the shot was not merely possible. It was by the numbers reliable. The difficulty was that the Ardennes in December 1944 did not often provide conditions under which a crew could do all of that preparation calmly and in the right sequence. The fog closed down. Roads that appeared on maps to run straight actually curved through dead ground. The infantry that was supposed to be screening the tank destroyer's position had sometimes withdrawn, without notification, 30 minutes before the Germans arrived. The conditions that made the long shot theoretically sound were the same conditions that the battlefield systematically destroyed. What replaced careful preparation, in the engagements that actually happened, was improvisation by crews who had enough accumulated experience to recognize an opportunity in the seconds it was available and act without deliberation. The open turret of the M36 was a factor in all of this that receives less attention than it deserves. The vehicle had no overhead armor protection for its crew. The turret was open to the sky. This was a deliberate design choice. It reduced weight, improved the crew's ability to scan for targets without the restricted vision of a closed hatch, and allowed faster ammunition handling, since the loader did not have to work within the confines of an enclosed space. In summer and in temperate conditions, experienced crews valued the visibility advantage enough to accept the vulnerability. In the Belgian winter of December 1944, with temperatures regularly below 15 degrees Fahrenheit and winds carrying snow horizontally across frozen fields, the open turret was an additional source of suffering on top of everything else the campaign demanded. Hellcat crews operating the smaller M18 reported the same problem. The vehicle's air-cooled engine drew cooling air through the crew compartment from front to rear, creating what one veteran described as a refrigerator on tracks. Gloves were a constant problem. Thick gloves made it difficult to feel the gun controls with precision. Thin gloves transmitted the cold of the metal directly to bare skin. Frostbite was reported among TD crews, as well as infantry. Men who sat in a stationary vehicle waiting for a German column that might or might not materialize for hours at a stretch, without the exertion that infantry movement provided, were at particular risk. None of this made the mission impossible. It made it harder in ways that accumulated over weeks and reduced the margin for error that a crew needed to execute a long-range shot correctly. A gunner whose hands were numb from cold and whose eyes were watering from wind was not operating at the same standard he had achieved in Texas in July. The difference was not catastrophic. Trained men adapt, and the American tank destroyer crews of the Ardennes campaign were not, by December, fresh trainees. They were combat veterans who had been in France since the breakout in July or August, but the difference existed. And any honest accounting of what those men accomplished in the winter of 1944 has to include the physical conditions under which they accomplished it. The German army that the M-36 crews were hunting in December 1944 was itself operating well below its theoretical capacity. The Ardennes offensive had been planned by Hitler over the objections of most of his senior commanders on the Western Front, who believed the German army in the West did not have the fuel, the replacement vehicles, or the manpower to sustain an offensive of the scale Hitler envisioned. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group E, had proposed a smaller operation, what the German staff called a small solution, that would straighten the front line and retake the initiative locally rather than driving all the way to Antwerp. Hitler rejected this and ordered the full operation. The logistics of the plan depended on German forces capturing American fuel dumps intact before their own supply ran out. The entire offensive had been launched on approximately 4 days of fuel for the armored formations. The Tigers and King Tigers of the offensive were particularly vulnerable to this fuel constraint. The Tiger I consumed approximately 1.5 gallons of fuel per mile on roads and more than 3 gallons per mile cross-country. The King Tiger's consumption was higher still. A journey of 60 miles by a Tiger column could exhaust 150 gallons of fuel, and the supply columns trying to keep the heavy tank battalions moving were traveling on the same congested, often cratered roads that the assault formations were fighting over. When the road network jammed, and it jammed within the first 2 days of the offensive as the German timetable fell behind, fuel trucks could not reach the forward units. The heavy tanks that had been designed to break through American lines instead sat immobile on Belgian roads, waiting for fuel that was either delayed or had not been allocated in sufficient quantities to begin with. The King Tigers of the 501st Heavy SS Tank Battalion, assigned to Camp Grubpaper, spent much of their time during the Ardennes offensive attempting to catch up with the faster-moving Panther and Panzer IV elements of the column that had moved ahead of them. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes terrain that the German planning staff had assessed as passable for armored vehicles proved, in practice, to be marginally passable for Panthers and extremely difficult for King Tigers. Where a 45-ton Panther could navigate a curve on a secondary road without excessive difficulty, a 68-ton King Tiger would scrape the embankment on the outside of the curve, crush the verge, and sometimes bog a vehicle in ground that appeared solid but was not. The King Tigers that reached the forward fighting positions during the battle did so days after the advance elements they were supposed to support had either broken through or been stopped. By the time the heavy tanks arrived in numbers, the American defense on the northern shoulder had stiffened around Elsenborn Ridge and at Stillmont. The moment when King Tigers might have broken through had passed. What this meant for M-36 crews engaging German armor in the Ardennes was that the Tigers and King Tigers they encountered were often not the invincible, freely maneuvering behemoths of German propaganda. They were frequently immobile, low on ammunition, separated from their supporting infantry, and positioned in whatever piece of ground offered cover from the American artillery and the fighter bombers that returned to the sky when the weather briefly cleared on December 23rd. A Tiger sitting in a farmyard with its engine cut to conserve fuel, waiting for a resupply that was no longer coming, was a different problem from a Tiger advancing aggressively down a road with infantry and supporting vehicles keeping its flanks clear. The M-36 crew that encountered the former had time, a clear angle, and a target that could not maneuver. The 1,500-yard shot, in those circumstances, was not a miracle of gunnery. It was the application of a weapon that had been designed for exactly this purpose against a target that the logistics of the German offensive had rendered temporarily manageable. German records and American after-action reports compiled after the battle tell a version of the story that historians have found consistently difficult to reconcile in exact detail. The after-action report of American tank destroyer battalions claimed tank kills that German records sometimes attributed to different causes: fuel exhaustion, mechanical breakdown, abandonment under air attack. The Germans kept their accounting on a total loss basis, meaning that a tank which was immobilized, struck by a round that damaged but did not destroy it, and then abandoned by its crew as the position became untenable might appear in German records as having been lost to mechanical causes rather than enemy action. The American crew that fired a round that put the vehicle out of action might record a confirmed kill that the German documentation listed differently. Neither record was necessarily dishonest. They were records produced by different organizations with different purposes. from different vantage points, under the same fog and stress that characterized every aspect of the Ardennes campaign. What is not in dispute is the overall outcome. When Camp Krupp Paper abandoned La Gleize on the night of December 24, 1944, the force that had started the offensive 9 days earlier with roughly 5,800 men and 58 tanks left behind 6 operational King Tigers, 13 Panthers, 6 Panzer IVs, 50 armored half-tracks, and the bulk of its heavy weapons. Approximately 800 men reached German lines on foot. The armored equipment they abandoned represented material that the German army could not replace. The King Tigers alone, each requiring months of production time at factories that were being progressively destroyed by Allied bombing, were gone. The offensive that they were supposed to spearhead had consumed them as much as any American gun crew had. The M-36 crews who had fought at Stillmont and Stavelot and across the frozen fields of the northern Ardennes in December did not, for the most part, return to anything like normal conditions in January. The Battle of the Bulge officially continued until January 25, 1945, and the American counteroffensive to reduce the German salient, to push back the lines to where they had been before December 16th, required fighting through the same terrain that the Germans had advanced over, now with the weather at its worst. January 1945 produced heavy snowfall and temperatures that averaged well below zero in the higher terrain. The M-36S that had survived the initial fighting required continuous maintenance to keep running. Hydraulic lines cracked in the cold. Ammunition fuses behaved differently at extreme temperatures than they had in the tables. Men who had been in continuous combat since Normandy were exhausted in ways that affected their judgment, and their reaction times in ways that no medical examination in December had measured or recorded. Into this exhausted, frozen campaign arrived, in late January and February, the answer to a question that the American Armored Force had been asking since the first Sherman encountered a Tiger in France. The T-26E3, the prototype that became the M-26 Pershing, had been authorized for production over the objections of Army Ground Forces Commander General Leslie McNair, who had argued as recently as 1943 that the Sherman was adequate for current and anticipated threats, and that a heavier tank would create logistical problems disproportionate to its combat value. McNair had been wrong, and the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest and at the Bulge had demonstrated this in terms that were difficult for any senior officer to dismiss. The T-26E3 weighed 42 tons, less than a Tiger, more than a Sherman, and mounted a 90mm gun in a closed, fully armored turret with frontal protection thick enough to resist the Tiger's 88mm gun at most combat ranges. It arrived in Europe in late January 1945 as part of what the Army called the Zebra Mission. 20 vehicles distributed 10 each to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, accompanied by a team of ordnance specialists to monitor the vehicle's performance in combat. The Pershing's combat debut came at Elsdorf, Germany on February 26, 1945, and it was not auspicious. A T-26E3, nicknamed Fireball, operator of the 33rd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division, was caught in an ambush by a concealed Tiger Eye from the German 301st Heavy Panzer Battalion, at a range of approximately 100 yards. The Tiger's first round penetrated the Pershing's turret through the machine gun port in the mantlet, killing the gunner and the loader. 2 additional rounds damaged the gun barrel and the commander's cupola. The crew survived, and the tank was eventually recovered and repaired. But the engagement was a reminder that proximity negated the advantages that armor and firepower on paper were supposed to provide. At 100 yards, in a night ambush, a Tiger and a Pershing were not separated by any meaningful technological gap. Both could kill the other. The crew that fired first, from a covered position that the enemy had not yet identified, had the advantage. The day after Fireball was disabled, Sergeant Nicholas Mashlana commanded T-26E3 No. 40 into the southern section of Elsdorf against a German counterattack composed of Tiger IS and Panzer IVs from the same battalion that had ambushed Fireball. At a range of 1,000 yards, moving, Mashlana's crew engaged a dug-in Tiger with 4 rounds of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition and killed it. 3 additional German armored vehicles were destroyed in the same engagement. The Pershing had proven itself. McNair, who had died in July 1944 when an American bomb fell short during the Cobra breakout and killed him at the front, had been definitively answered. the gun that the Army had resisted fielding until the war's final months had demonstrated, in 4 rounds from a moving platform 1,000 yards, exactly what it could do. The tank destroyer force had been making a similar argument with less elegant equipment since September 1944, with less institutional support and under circumstances that require their crews to extract the maximum from a weapon that was not, in a straight fight at short range, anything like equal to the vehicle it was sent to destroy. The M36 open turret made its crew vulnerable to the artillery and mortar fire that accompanied German armor. Its thin hull armor could be penetrated by the 88mm gun at any range where the Tiger could see it. The doctrine that was supposed to protect it, the flanking approach, the prepared ambush, the quick shot and withdrawal, work when conditions permitted it and fail when they did not. The men inside the M36 knew all of this better than the field manuals did. What they also knew, and what the record of the Ardennes campaign confirms when examined engagement by engagement rather than in the aggregate statistics that the official histories prefer, was that the doctrine worked often enough. The 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion's kill of a King Tiger near Freheldenhoven in December 1944 was not a statistical anomaly. It was a product of the same method that the battalion had been developing since November. The identification of geometry that the 90mm gun could exploit, the patience to wait for that geometry to present itself, and the execution in the seconds it was available. The snow and the fog and the cold and the exhaustion were the conditions under which that method had to be applied. The men who applied it successfully did so not because they were different in any fundamental way from the men who had trained beside them at Camp Hood or Camp Bowie and not come home from France. They were men who, on specific days and specific places, had gotten the angle right. When the last German armored vehicles withdrew from the Ardennes salient in January 1945, and the American lines returned to roughly where they had been before December 16th, what remained on the Belgian and Luxembourg and German fields over which the fighting had moved were tank hulks of both sides, frozen in positions that would not thaw for months. The King Tigers that Camp Grub Paper had abandoned at La Glise stood in the snow with their hatches open and their ammunition racks empty. Some still had their engines intact. Their crews had walked away from them because there was no fuel to move them and no way to get fuel to them in time. They had not been knocked out by any gun. They had been defeated by a supply problem that the German planners had known about before the offensive began and had gambled they could solve with capture American fuel dumps that they never reached. The Tigers that had been killed by American tank destroyers and by combined arms engagements involving artillery, infantry anti-tank weapons, and tank fire were fewer in number and more difficult to locate on the post-war maps. Their crews had mostly not survived to walk away. The after-action reports that documented those engagements, the range estimates, the ammunition types, the times and map references, sat in the National Archives alongside the vehicle maintenance records and the casualty rosters and the unit histories, most of them unread for decades after men who had written them were gone. The tank destroyer arm itself did not survive the war's end in organizational form. The Army formally disbanded the tank destroyer branch in the demobilization of 1945, redistributing its personnel and its equipment into the armor branch and the artillery. The M36 was declared obsolete in 1946, though a number were kept in storage and later saw service with Allied nations and in Korea. The doctrine that had created it, the idea of a specialized anti-armor force held in reserve and committed aggressively when the armored threat materialized, was evaluated by the post-war Army and found insufficient as the sole answer to the anti-tank problem. The Sherman that had been the main tank of the campaign was replaced in the post-war Army by the M26 and then by the M46, M47, and M48 patent series, all heavier, all better armed, all incorporating lessons about the relationship between gun caliber and armor that the fighting in France and Belgium had demonstrated at such cost. The crew of the M36 near Freheldenhoven that December, the crew of Sergeant Mashlonik's Pershing at Elsdorf that February, the surviving tank destroyer crews who came home from Belgium and Germany and rebuilt their lives in the United States in 1945 and 1946, they did not, in most cases, record in any formal way what they had learned about the geometry of an armored engagement at 1,500 yards in a frozen field. They knew it the way a craftsman knows a specific technique, as muscle memory and accumulated judgment, not as a set of written propositions. The field manuals they had trained on contained the tables, the penetration figures, the elevation adjustments. What the field manuals did not contain was a knowledge of when, in the specific chaos of a Belgian winter battlefield, the geometry would briefly align and the window would open. They carried that knowledge home with them, and when it was no longer needed, they put it down. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.